She accused him of stealing company money and fired him in front of everyone. As security escorted 38-year-old single father Ethan Carter out of the building, employees whispered that he deserved it. The evidence seemed undeniable. Thousands of dollars missing from a company account, and Ethan's name attached to every transaction. But 3 days later, CEO Victoria Hayes received the shock of her life. The same man she had humiliated in front of the entire staff returned to her office door carrying her missing $37,000 designer handbag, every single dollar still inside. What Ethan revealed next exposed a betrayal far bigger than anyone had imagined, and forced Victoria to question everything she thought she knew about loyalty, judgment, and the price of being wrong. Ethan Carter had spent 12 years inside the same building, 12 years of early mornings and late nights, of covering for colleagues during family emergencies, of staying through the holidays when no one else would volunteer. He had started at the company as a junior financial analyst, straight out of graduate school, a young man with a daughter to raise alone, and a quiet determination that impressed even the most skeptical of his supervisors. His wife had passed when their daughter, Lily, was just 18 months old. And in the years that followed, Ethan had built his entire world around two things: that little girl, and the work that kept her fed and housed, and enrolled in the school she loved. He was not flashy. He did not seek promotions aggressively or campaign for attention during executive meetings. He simply did his job with a precision and an honesty that made him the kind of employee every finance department quietly depended on, but rarely celebrated. His colleagues came to him when they were confused about ledgers. His supervisors relied on his quarterly reviews, without auditing them a second time. He was, by every measure that mattered, the last person anyone would suspect of stealing. And yet, on a Tuesday morning in early November, that is exactly what Victoria Hayes stood before a room full of people and accused him of doing. The company had been preparing for weeks to finalize a contract worth several $1 million. The kind of deal that would expand operations into 2 new states and secure employment for dozens of new hires. The mood in the offices had been electric, the kind of controlled excitement that comes when hard work is finally about to pay off. Finance teams had been running projections, legal had been reviewing terms, and Victoria herself had been sleeping fewer than 5 hours a night, trying to ensure nothing went wrong. It was in that climate of high stakes and raw nerves that the accounting department flagged an anomaly. A series of transactions had moved money out of a discretionary operations fund, not in one large suspicious sum, but in careful, incremental withdrawals spread across 6 weeks, each one small enough to avoid automated alerts, but collectively totaling just over $48,000. When the system administrator pulled the access logs, one username appeared consistently across every transaction: E. Carter. The emergency meeting was called before 9 in the morning. Ethan had arrived at the office carrying a cup of coffee and his daughter's permission slip for a school field trip, which he had planned to drop in the outbox before the workday started. He had no idea what was waiting for him in the third-floor conference room. When he walked through the door and saw not just his direct manager but Victoria Hayes, standing at the head of the table flanked by 2 members of human resources and the head of corporate security, he felt the air change before a single word was spoken. Victoria did not sit down. She stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the way that people who had worked with her for years recognized as the posture she adopted when a decision had already been made. The logs were on the table. The figures were highlighted in red. His name was circled. Victoria looked at him and said, directly and without preamble, that the evidence showed he had been systematically withdrawing company funds over the past 6 weeks, and that his employment was being terminated immediately pending a full investigation and potential criminal referral. Ethan set his coffee down. He looked at the papers. His hands were steady, but the steadiness came from shock, not composure, the kind of stillness that falls over a person when the ground beneath them disappears and the brain has not yet caught up with the falling. He said he had not made those transactions. He said he wanted to see the full log, not just the highlights. He said there had to be an explanation, because he had not touched that fund outside of his authorized quarterly reconciliation. Victoria listened to perhaps 30 seconds of this before she raised one hand and told him that she had not scheduled a debate. The evidence was in front of the room. Protocols had to be followed. She told him he was to hand over his badge and his access card, and that security would escort him from the building. Someone near the back of the room made a sound, not quite a gasp, more the involuntary intake of breath that comes when watching something irreversible unfold. Ethan looked around the table at faces he had known for years. Most of them looked away. The ones who did not wore expressions he would remember for a long time, not cruelty, exactly, but something worse. The careful neutrality of people who had already decided they did not want to be associated with the wrong side of whatever this turned out to be. He stood up slowly. He picked up his coffee. And before the security officer reached him, he looked at Victoria Hayes and said, quietly and without malice, "One day, you will know you made a mistake." It was not a threat. Anyone who heard the way he said it would have understood that it was not a threat. It was something closer to a prophecy, the words of a man who had no power left, except the certainty that the truth still existed somewhere, and that it was only a matter of time. The walk from the conference room to the lobby took 4 minutes. Ethan counted each step without meaning to. The security officer, a man named Dale who had always greeted Ethan by name and once borrowed $20 for a birthday cake, kept his eyes forward and said nothing. The elevator ride was silent. The lobby doors opened to a gray November morning, and just like that, 12 years ended on a sidewalk with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and nowhere to be. The professional damage happened faster than Ethan had anticipated, though in retrospect he should not have been surprised. In industries where reputation functions as currency, word travels at the speed of a forwarded email, and someone he never found out who had already shared the basic facts of his termination within hours of his escort from the building. By the end of the first day, 2 recruiters who had reached out to him in the past suddenly stopped responding. By the end of the second, a former colleague texted him to say that someone in their shared professional network had been asking questions about whether Ethan had ever shown signs of financial irregularities in previous roles. The message was delivered with sympathy, but the implication was clear. The story was already spreading, and it was spreading in the version that Victoria Hayes's company had authored, not the one that was actually true. Ethan sat at his kitchen table that second night after he had put Lily to bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He thought about anger. He considered it carefully, the way he might consider a financial instrument with unknown risks, and decided that anger was a luxury he could not afford. Anger would cloud the one thing he still had, that no one could take from him, which was the ability to think clearly. What most people did not know about Ethan Carter, what had never come up in the casual conversations of office life because he was not the kind of man who talked about himself, was that before joining the company he had spent 3 years working as a forensic financial examiner for a Doppler, mid-sized auditing firm. He had been brought in on fraud investigations. He had testified in 2 civil cases. He knew, in a way that was professional and practical, rather than abstract, exactly how a financial crime was constructed, and more importantly, exactly how it was concealed. Which meant he also knew how to find the seams where the concealment was imperfect. If someone had used his credentials to move that money, they had left traces, not obvious ones, not the kind that would survive a cursory review, but traces nonetheless. Digital systems keep records, the way old houses keep drafts through the gaps in what was supposedly sealed. He began with his email archive, which he had the foresight to download to a personal encrypted drive as part of his standard monthly backup routine. A habit from his auditing days that his previous IT supervisor had once jokingly called paranoid. He worked through his old messages in chronological order, looking not for what was there, but for what was missing. Then he moved to system access logs, pulling what he could from his personal device's cached history before his remote access had been revoked. He reached out, carefully and selectively, to 2 former colleagues. He trusted people who had worked alongside him long enough to know what his professional integrity was worth, and who he was certain would not immediately report the contact to human resources. He framed his questions as clarifications, not investigations. He asked about process, about timing, about who had been doing what during specific windows. He listened more than he spoke, and slowly, across 2 days of quiet, methodical work at his kitchen table while Lily was at school, A picture began to emerge that was different in critical ways from the one that had been presented in that conference room. There were discrepancies in the timestamps. The transactions attributed to his username had been initiated during a 40-minute window on 3 separate occasions, each time coinciding precisely with periods when Ethan had been in documented off-site meetings with external vendors, meetings that were logged in the shared calendar system and confirmed by outside parties who had signed him in and out of their facilities. He had not been at his desk. He could not have been. Someone had accessed his credentials from a different machine, almost certainly from inside the building, and had been careful enough to choose moments when his absence would be difficult to notice in real time, but had not anticipated that the external meeting logs would survive the termination process intact. Beyond the timestamps, there were 2 internal emails, both sent from a generic administrative account that routed through a shared server that had been used to authorize one of the withdrawals through a secondary approval chain. The authorizing name on both emails was not Ethan's. It was someone else's entirely. Someone who had signed off on both transactions using what appeared to be a dual-control workaround that should have triggered an audit flag, but had somehow been processed without one. Ethan stared at that name for a long time. He recognized it immediately, and the recognition brought with it a cold, specific dread, not because he had not considered the possibility of internal betrayal, but because of who this particular person was and how completely Victoria Hayes trusted them. He was still sitting with that knowledge, still deciding what to do with it, how to handle it, whether there was any version of this that did not require him to walk back into a situation where he had already been publicly humiliated, and ask the person who had fired him to listen to him now, when his phone buzzed with a call from a number he did not recognize. He almost did not answer. In the 3 days since his termination, his phone had rung with a mixture of well-meaning acquaintances, and one call from a journalist who had somehow heard a fragment of the story and wanted a comment. He was not in the mood for any of it, but something made him pick up. He answered with his name, cautious and flat. The voice on the other end did not introduce itself immediately. It said, after a brief pause, "I think I found something that belongs to you." It took him 2 seconds to realize it was the wrong direction entirely, whoever this was. They were not looking for him. They were looking for someone else. Then the voice said a name, and Ethan Carter, sitting at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and 12 years of professional reputation in ruins, suddenly had a second piece of the puzzle he had not been looking for at all. Victoria Hayes was not accustomed to losing things. She was, in the way that genuinely disciplined people sometimes are, almost compulsively organized, the kind of person whose desk was clean at the end of every day, who kept her calendar updated to the quarter hour, who maintained a mental inventory of every object in her possession and its current location. She had built a company from a concept and a borrowed conference room to a regional employer with over 200 staff members by applying the same rigorous attention to her business that she applied to her personal life. She did not misplace things. She did not overlook details. She did not make the kind of careless errors that cost people their possessions or their composure. Which was why the realization, standing in the lobby of a private event space at 11:30 on a Thursday night, 3 days after Ethan Carter had been escorted from her building, that her handbag was gone, hit her with a particular force that went beyond the material loss. The bag was a limited edition piece from a European designer whose wait list ran to 18 months, a gift she had allowed herself after the company's most profitable quarter ever, a small, deliberate indulgence in a life that otherwise ran on discipline and delayed gratification. But the value of the bag itself was almost incidental to what it contained. Inside, her passport, needed for an international meeting the following week. A USB drive with a compressed archive of the preliminary contract terms for the deal they had been building for months. A vintage wristwatch that had belonged to her grandmother and was irreplaceable in every sense that mattered. And $37,000 in cash, a withdrawal she had made that afternoon to pay for a private arrangement involving a consultant she had retained off the books, the kind of situation that existed in the gray zone of business operations, and that she did not want traveling through wire transfers. The cash alone was a problem. The documents were worse. If they reached a competitor or a journalist, The consequences for the pending deal would be catastrophic. She reported it to the event's security staff. She requested the camera footage. She called the police from the parking lot and gave a statement that carefully omitted the contents of the bag in their entirety, citing personal items and a sum of cash she described as far smaller than the actual amount. She hired a private investigator before midnight, using a contact she had kept in her phone for situations that required discretion. She did all of this efficiently and without visible panic, because panic was not a mode she allowed herself in professional contexts. But underneath the efficiency, there was something she had not felt in a long time: genuine fear, not of financial loss, but of exposure, not of what had been taken, but of what could be done with it. She returned to her apartment after 2 in the morning and sat in her kitchen, which was large and immaculate and completely silent, and felt, for the first time in years, entirely alone with a problem she could not solve by working harder. The private investigator produced nothing useful by the following afternoon. The camera footage from the event space showed the table where she had placed the bag, and it showed a 40-second window of blind coverage during which a passing figure, obscured, angle inconclusive, had moved through the frame. The police called once to confirm they had logged the report and would be in touch. They were not in touch again. Victoria went through the next day and a half in a state of controlled surface function that hid a mounting internal alarm. She had begun drafting contingency plans for the contract documents, reaching out quietly to her legal team about what exposure they might face if the preliminary terms became public. She was in the middle of reviewing those contingency drafts when her phone rang. The number was not in her contacts. She answered with the clipped, professional tone she used for unfamiliar callers. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then a voice she recognized, the voice of the man she had fired 4 days ago, said 3 words that stopped every thought she was in the middle of having. "I think," Ethan Carter said, steadily and without any audible satisfaction, "that you might be looking for something." Victoria did not speak for several seconds. She was calculating, the way she always calculated when unexpected variables appeared, trying to determine what angle this was coming from and what the most defensible response would be. Her first instinct was that he was calling to negotiate, that he had somehow found the bag, recognized what it represented, and was positioning himself for a settlement that would make the termination go away quietly in exchange for the return of what he held. Her second instinct, arriving almost simultaneously, was that this was a setup of some kind, that he was recording the call, looking for an admission or a statement she could not walk back. She trusted neither instinct entirely, which was unusual for her. She said, carefully, "Who is this?" even though she knew. He told her his name. She said nothing. He described the bag in precise detail. The color, the hardware finish, the dimensions, the monogram on the inner lining that she had added as a personalization, and that would not be visible in any public photograph. He described it with the accuracy of someone who had it in front of him. Victoria felt the calculation shift. She asked, without committing to anything, where he was. He gave her an address, a coffee shop 2 miles from her office. He said he would be there the following morning at 8, and that if she chose not to come, he would turn the bag in to the police property room with a full description of its contents. The last sentence was not a threat. It was logistically accurate. She understood the difference. She said she would be there. The coffee shop was the kind of place that opened early for people who had somewhere to be, with large windows and plain wooden tables, and staff who moved quickly and asked no unnecessary questions. Victoria arrived 4 minutes early, because she arrived 4 minutes early to everything. Ethan was already there, seated at a corner table with a coffee he had not touched, and the bag on the seat beside him, her bag, unmistakable, sitting against the cafe wall as casually as if it had simply forgotten to go anywhere. Victoria crossed the room without stopping at the counter. She sat down across from him. She looked at the bag, and then at him, and waited, because she had found, over years of negotiation, that silence extracted more information than questions did. Ethan slid the bag across the table toward her, without ceremony. She unclipped the closure and checked the contents with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what should be there. The cash was bundled exactly as she had packed it. The watch was in its protective sleeve. The passport, the drive, every item accounted for, undisturbed, in the precise order she had placed things when she packed the bag the previous Thursday morning. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression that was not quite neutral but was very controlled, the face of someone who had decided in advance to be steady, regardless of how this moment went. She asked him why. He said it was the right thing to do. She waited to see if there was more, because there was almost always more when someone opened with principle. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "Also, I found something else while I had the bag." Victoria's hands stilled on the clasp. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. It was a printout. She reached for it and unfolded it and looked at a row of time-stamped system access entries. She recognized the format immediately. It was the same type of log that had been presented at his termination meeting. But the entries on this sheet were different. They covered dates and times she had not seen before. And they told a story that contradicted, in specific and documentable ways, the story that had ended his career 4 days ago. Victoria was a person who acted quickly. It was one of her most frequently noted qualities. By people who admired her, and by people who did not, she made decisions fast, moved on them faster, and did not tend to second-guess. The log in her hands required her to do something she rarely did. Stop. She studied the timestamps. She cross-referenced them in her mind against what she knew of Ethan's schedule from 12 years of shared calendar access. She thought about the vendor meetings. She thought about the sign-in logs. She asked quietly where he had obtained this. He explained his background, the forensic auditing years, the encrypted backup of his own email archive, the gaps in the timestamps he had identified. He was precise and unemotional in his explanation, the way a person is when they have rehearsed something not for dramatic effect but simply to get through it cleanly, without losing the thread. Victoria listened without interrupting. When he finished, she folded the printout carefully and set it on the table. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she said the thing she had not said to him at the termination meeting, which was, "Tell me everything." She said it not as a command, but as a request. And that distinction, small as it was, changed the temperature of the conversation entirely. Ethan did not tell her everything in the coffee shop. There was too much. And the public setting was not the right venue for what the evidence eventually added up to. What he told her was enough to establish that the case against him had critical procedural weaknesses, that the timestamp discrepancies were documentable and verifiable through external sources, and that the authorization trail for at least 2 of the flagged transactions ran through a secondary approval chain that did not include his name at any stage. Victoria listened carefully. She asked precise questions. She did not apologize, not yet, and he did not expect her to, not yet. What she did instead was something he respected more than an immediate apology would have been. She took the information seriously. She did not minimize it. She did not suggest alternative interpretations that would let her original decision stand. She looked at the data with the same intensity she brought to every financial review that crossed her desk, and she acknowledged, without theatrical admission, that what she was looking at did not match the picture she had been given. She said she needed to run a full internal audit. She asked if he was willing to share the complete set of materials he had compiled. He said he was, on the condition that they establish a clear chain of custody before anything was shared, so that nothing could be altered or disappeared. She agreed without hesitation. That agreement, efficient, professional, no drama, was the first moment Ethan Carter felt something other than the cold, flat exhaustion that had settled over him since Tuesday. They met twice more, over the following 4 days. Not in the coffee shop, but in a small conference room at a law firm Victoria retained for sensitive matters neutral ground, recorded by neither party, with a third-party attorney present as a witness to the document review. Ethan brought everything: the email archive, the timestamp printouts, the cached access logs from his personal device, and a detailed written analysis that laid out, in sequence and with supporting citations, exactly how the pattern of transactions could not have been executed by someone in his physical location on those dates. Victoria's internal technology team verified independently, using the company's own server records, that the timestamps on Ethan's vendor meeting sign-ins were accurate, and that the access entries had originated from a machine registered to a different user profile, one that had been masked behind his credentials through a permission escalation exploit that should have been caught by their security protocols but had not been. The technology team's findings were delivered in writing. Victoria read the report alone in her office with the door closed. When she emerged, she called one person into her office and asked them to sit down. The person who sat down across from her was Marcus Webb, her director of internal operations, a man she had hired 6 years ago and had promoted twice, a man whose professional judgment she had trusted without qualification for most of those 6 years. Marcus Webb was 51 years old and had spent the years before joining Victoria's company navigating a career that had been, in retrospect, characterized by a very specific pattern: lateral moves that followed periods of financial scrutiny at his previous employers, gaps in his resume that had been explained during his interview as consulting periods, and that Victoria had accepted without deeper verification because his references were strong and his presentation was immaculate. He was charming in the particular way that high-functioning deceivers often are: attentive, personable, apparently generous with credit and praise, the kind of manager who made people feel seen without ever quite revealing what he himself was thinking. He had been, Victoria would later reflect, exactly the kind of person designed to be trusted by exactly the kind of person she was. Someone who moved fast, rewarded competence, and interpreted smooth professionalism as evidence of integrity rather than as a skill set that could be applied in any direction. When Victoria laid the documents on her desk and asked Marcus to explain the access logs, he did something she had seen many times in termination meetings. He reached for a plausible story first. Technical error. System glitch. Someone else must have used his profile. His tone was measured and confused in the specific calibrated way of a person who is prepared for this possibility and practiced the performance of surprise. Victoria let him speak. Then she placed a second document on the desk: the email chain, the authorizations, the internal routing records that established not just the access, but the deliberate construction of an authorization chain designed to bypass the standard controls. She watched his face move through its prepared expressions and find, finally, no viable landing place. The room was very quiet. Marcus said nothing for a long time. Then, slowly, the story changed. It did not become the truth all at once. It became the truth in stages, the way stories do when the person telling them is calculating each disclosure against the legal exposure it creates. But it became enough of the truth, before the end of that conversation, to confirm what the documents had already established: that Marcus Webb had been systematically redirecting company funds for 14 months, that he had used Ethan's credentials as a deliberate shield after identifying a window of opportunity created by a permissions error he had himself engineered, and that the speed and finality of Ethan's termination had been, from his perspective, the ideal outcome, a clean exit for the actual culprit disguised as justice. Victoria terminated Marcus Webb's employment before 5 o'clock that afternoon. She notified the company's legal counsel, the board's audit committee, and the external accounting firm that handled their compliance reviews. She submitted a formal disclosure to the relevant financial regulatory body. She arranged for a meeting of the full board of directors for the following Monday morning. She did all of this in a span of 6 hours, with the same driven efficiency she brought to every operational decision, and at no point during those 6 hours did she allow herself to fully feel the specific weight of what the day's revelations had added up to. There would be time for that later. There was work to do first. But late that evening, sitting again in her kitchen in the large, clean apartment, she allowed herself to sit with it. She had fired an innocent man. Not carelessly, not in bad faith, not out of malice, but publicly, definitively, in a manner that had done real and measurable damage to his career and his standing in the community where he worked. She had been given a narrative that matched a set of data points, and she had acted on that narrative without allowing the person most affected by it to complete a sentence in his own defense. She had believed herself to be decisive. She now understood she had confused decisiveness with certainty. and that the confusion had cost someone who did not deserve it 12 years of professional trust, reduced overnight to a headline no one had corrected yet. The board meeting on Monday morning ran for 3.5 hours. Victoria presented the full findings in sequence: the original anomaly detection, the attribution to Ethan's credentials, the termination, the recovery of the bag, Ethan's own investigation, the technology team's verification, and finally the disclosure from Marcus Webb and the documentary evidence supporting it. She presented it without defensiveness and without editorializing in her own favor, which was noticed by every person in the room, because they had all watched her manage crises before, and they knew how she typically controlled the narrative. This time, she did not control the narrative. She reported it. The board asked questions for 2 hours. They were not gentle questions. They covered the security protocols that had allowed the credential exploit, the human resources processes that had permitted a same-day termination without a formal investigative hold, the background verification gaps in Marcus Webb's original hiring, and the specific decision chain on the morning of Ethan's firing. Victoria answered every question directly and accepted every criticism that was accurate, which was most of them. At the end of the meeting, the board issued a formal motion to pursue full civil and criminal remedies against Marcus Webb, to commission an independent external audit of internal security protocols, and to initiate a process of public exoneration and remediation for Ethan Carter. Victoria asked to handle the conversation with Ethan herself. The board agreed. She called him that afternoon and asked if they could meet, in person, in her office. She said she had things to tell him that she wanted to say directly, not through legal intermediaries or formal letters. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said yes. He arrived the following morning at 9. He addressed formally, in the same way she had noticed he dressed for every important meeting, not expensively but carefully, the kind of clothes that communicated respect for the gravity of the situation. He sat across from her desk. She did not sit behind the desk. She pulled a chair from the side of the room and sat at the same level as him, because the desk felt, under the circumstances, like a prop she no longer had the right to put between them. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She had written it down the night before, then put it away because she did not want to read from notes, and she wanted it to come out as it actually was, rather than as a performance of what it should be. She told him that she had been wrong. Not wrong in the narrow technical sense of having followed a flawed protocol, but wrong in the deeper sense of having failed to extend to him, in the most consequential moment of his professional life, the basic consideration of being heard. She said she had been given evidence and had treated evidence as truth, forgetting that evidence is always assembled by someone with a perspective, and that the perspective in this case had been deliberately corrupted. She said the speed of her decision had felt, to her, like strength, like the decisiveness that had built the company, and she was only now understanding that what she had actually practiced in that conference room was not strength but impatience, and that the cost of that impatience had been paid entirely by him. She did not say these things quickly. She said them the way someone says the things they have been awake with at 3 in the morning, slowly, with pauses, without the executive confidence that usually accompanied every word she spoke in professional settings. She said she was deeply sorry. She said she would like, if he was willing, to offer him full reinstatement at his previous seniority level, with retroactive compensation for the period of his termination, and that the company would issue a formal public statement through every appropriate channel correcting the record, and acknowledging that his dismissal had been based on fraudulent evidence. She said that she understood if he did not want to come back. She said she would support whatever decision he made. Ethan listened to all of it. He had thought carefully, in the days leading up to this meeting, about what he wanted his own response to be. He had thought about what Lily would think when she was older, and he explained this to her, as he would eventually have to do. He had thought about the version of himself who walked into this room and accepted the apology without conditions, and the version who walked in and did not accept it at all, and the version who walked in and made the acceptance mean something more than just the restoration of the individual situation. He was not angry at Victoria Hayes, which surprised him a little. He understood how it had happened, not the betrayal by Marcus, which was simply the act of a person who had decided that other people's integrity was a tool to be used, but the speed of Victoria's decision, the failure of the moment in the conference room. He had watched her present to the board. He had read the board's report. He could see, in the accounting of her own decisions, that she had genuinely grappled with what she had done. That meant something. It was not enough on its own, but it meant something. He looked at her for a long moment across the space between their chairs. And then, he said what he had decided to say. He told her he would come back, but not simply, and not only for himself. He said that what had happened to him could happen to anyone in that building, that a company where a senior employee's 12-year record could be dissolved in a single meeting on the basis of unverified logs was a company where every person on the payroll was potentially one bad actor, away from the same outcome. He said he would return under specific conditions. The first, a formal review and redesign of the termination and disciplinary process to include a mandatory investigative hold period before any dismissal related to financial misconduct, during which the accused would have the right to respond in writing to specific allegations before any public action was taken. The second, an independent employee advocacy function not part of HR that could receive and investigate internal complaints without reporting through management chains that might have conflicts of interest. The third, a commitment from the board, in writing, to fund an annual internal security audit conducted by an external firm with no existing relationship to the company. He said he was not making these demands as punishments. He was making them as conditions of a workplace he could believe in, because he had learned in the past 2 weeks that a workplace he could believe in was not a given. It had to be built deliberately, and it had to be rebuilt when it failed. Victoria listened to all 3 conditions without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once and said, simply, "Done." The formal reinstatement was announced at an all-staff meeting 10 days later. Victoria presented the findings of the internal investigation, the external audit report, and the board's conclusions in a presentation that lasted 40 minutes and left no ambiguity about what had happened or who had done what. She named Marcus Webb. She described the credential exploit and the deliberate framing. She described her own decision-making at the termination meeting and characterized it, in those precise words, as a failure of due process that she took full personal responsibility for. Then she asked Ethan Carter to stand. He stood. The applause started near the back of the room, from a cluster of colleagues he had worked closest with over the years, and then spread until the entire room was standing, and the sound of it was not the polite professional applause of a company event, but something more genuine and more complicated than that, carrying in it the specific relief that comes when a story that seemed to end badly turns out not to be over yet. Ethan returned to his desk the following Monday. His office had been kept as it was no one had cleared it in the 2 weeks he was gone, which he later learned had been a quiet instruction from Victoria that no one questioned. He sat down. He opened his laptop. He ran through the pending reconciliations that had accumulated in his absence. He found, on his keyboard, a handwritten note from his colleague Rachel Simmons, who had been the person in the back of the conference room the morning he was fired, the one whose face he had watched as he tried to explain himself, and who had looked at the floor. The note said, "I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't." He folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer. He was not angry at Rachel either. People were complicated, and fear was a powerful instruction. What mattered now was what came next. The months that followed were, in the way that significant institutional change sometimes is when it is pursued with genuine commitment rather than public relations management, genuinely transformative. The new investigative hold protocol was written and ratified within 6 weeks. The independent employee advocacy function was staffed and made operational within 3 months, with a director hired from an external ombudsman organization who had no prior relationship with any of the company's existing management. The external security audit produced 37 actionable recommendations, 22 of which were implemented within the first quarter. The major contract, the one that had been in preparation on the morning of the emergency meeting, was finalized 4 months after Ethan's reinstatement, at terms that were more favorable than the original projection, partly because the company's demonstrated capacity for internal accountability during a period of significant reputational risk had impressed the counterparty's due diligence team. Victoria Hayes did not emerge from the experience unchanged. This was visible not in dramatic ways but in the smaller operational habits that people who worked closely with her noticed and occasionally mentioned to each other. She was more likely now to ask questions before conclusions. She was more likely to pause before a decision that felt urgent, to examine whether the urgency was real or manufactured by the anxiety of the moment. She had developed, through a hard and public education, a more precise understanding of the difference between pattern recognition, which had made her a successful executive, and premature certainty, which had made her a person who fired an innocent man in front of his colleagues on a Tuesday morning. She did not broadcast this understanding, or turn it into a leadership lesson she delivered in all-hands meetings. She simply practiced it, quietly, in the daily decisions that accumulated over months, into something that looked, from the outside, like a subtly different kind of leadership. Several months after his reinstatement, on a Friday afternoon in early spring, Ethan was walking back from a meeting on the 4th floor when he passed the large windows that looked down into the lobby. He paused for a moment, without meaning to. Below, Victoria was standing near the reception desk, talking with the new building security manager about the updated protocol for visitor sign-ins, one of the procedures that had been modified as part of the post-audit changes. She was listening more than she was talking, which was new. The security manager was describing a workflow she had not been briefed on, and instead of defaulting to correction or instruction, she was asking him to walk her through it step by step. Ethan watched this for a moment. He did not feel, standing at that window, the complex mixture of vindication and residual injury that had characterized the earlier months. What he felt was something quieter and more durable than those emotions, something that had no clean name but was adjacent to the feeling of a long project finally arriving at a state of completion that, while imperfect, was genuinely better than where it started. Lily was 11 now, and had recently decided she wanted to be an architect. She had told him this at dinner the previous week, with the absolute certainty of an 11-year-old who has identified something that feels right in her bones, and he had listened to her explain her reasons with the particular attention he gave to everything she said, the attention of a man who understood, in a personal and non-abstract way, what it meant to be heard. He had told her he thought she would be extraordinary at it. He had meant it entirely. There was a small framed photo on the corner of his desk now, newly placed him and Lily at the school field trip she had attended the same week he was fired, a trip whose permission slip he had never gotten to the outbox. He had found the photo on his phone in the weeks after his reinstatement, and had printed it and framed it as a small, deliberate act of documentation, proof that the life he had been building had continued in spite of everything, had not been interrupted in the places that mattered most. Lily was grinning in the photo, squinting against the sunlight, wearing a backpack that was almost as large as she was. He was looking at her rather than at the camera. He was smiling in the distracted, involuntary way of someone who has forgotten entirely that a picture is being taken. The truth, as it turned out, had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting in the timestamps of a server log, in the cached files of a personal drive, in the specific color of a designer bag, and the precise bundle of a stack of cash, and the steadiness of a man who had every reason to be bitter, and chose instead to return what did not belong to him. It had been waiting in the habit of a person who backed up his own email, because he had once learned, in a different job, in a different decade, that documentation was the only witness that could not be intimidated or reassigned or told to look at the floor. It had been waiting in the 12 years of a professional record that no single accusation, however public and however damaging, had actually erased because the people who had watched Ethan Carter work for more than a decade knew what they knew, and they had been waiting, quietly, for the story to catch up. The loudest moments of the whole situation had been at the beginning. The conference room, the security escort, the whispers in the elevator bank. But the moments that endured were not those. They were smaller and more specific. They were a folded note on a keyboard, and a handwritten apology, and an 11-year-old explaining her plans for the future, with total confidence that the person listening would take them seriously. They were a protocol change, buried in a procedural handbook that no one would ever know Ethan Carter had insisted on, but that would protect some future employee, someone not yet hired, in a situation not yet imagined, from the particular loneliness of standing in front of a room full of people and speaking the truth to no one who is willing to hear it. That, in the end, was what remained. Not the vindication, though the vindication mattered. Not the apology, though the apology was real. What remained was the shape of what a person chose to do with the time between being wronged and being believed, and whether, in that difficult and unglamorous interval, they found a way to be exactly who they had always claimed to be. Victoria thought about that more than once in the months that followed, the specific quality of resolve it required to return something that could have been kept, to knock on a door that had been slammed shut in your face, to offer evidence to someone who had refused to hear your explanation. She had built her career on the belief that character was revealed in decisions made under pressure, in the moments when the easier path and the right path diverged, and a person had to choose. She had believed, before that November morning, that she understood what that principle looked like in practice. She understood it better now. It looked like a man carrying a bag he could have walked away from. It looked like a kitchen table covered in printed logs, and an encrypted drive, and a child's field trip permission slip that never made it to the outbox. It looked like choosing, in the space between being wronged and being vindicated, to spend that time building something true rather than nursing something justified. She had asked him once, months later, in a conversation that was no longer formal and had begun to take on the tentative quality of two people learning how to be colleagues again rather than adversaries, what had made him decide to call her, not to come back to the company. That decision had come later, after the conditions were agreed to and the board had acted. But the call itself, the decision to pick up a phone and tell the person who had destroyed his professional reputation that he had found the bag she was missing. He had thought about his answer for a moment, in the specific, unhurried way he had of considering things before speaking. Then he said that he had a daughter watching everything he did, and that he had always understood his job as a parent to be less about instruction and more about demonstration. He could explain integrity to Lily every day of her life, or he could show her what it looked like when it cost something. He preferred to show her. Victoria had not said anything for a moment. Then, she said she thought Lily was lucky. He said, without any false modesty, and with a warmth that was entirely genuine, "No, I am." That, perhaps, was where the story found its real ending, not in the board resolution, or the protocol changes, or the applause at the all-staff meeting, but in the simple, unremarkable truth of a father who knew exactly what he was doing, and why, and for whom. Not every story of injustice ends in restoration. Not every person who is wronged gets the opportunity to return what was lost and receive in exchange the chance to be heard. Ethan Carter was lucky in that specific way, and he knew it, and he did not waste it. The luck did not diminish the character it had revealed. If anything, it made the character more visible because the circumstances had been unusual enough to put a version of ordinary human integrity on display that most people spent their whole lives performing in private, without an audience and without a resolution, quietly and without credit, simply because it was the right thing to do. The company continued. Victoria continued. Lily continued, growing toward whatever shape her life would take. And Ethan Carter sat at his desk on a Monday morning with a cup of coffee and a stack of reconciliations and a framed photograph and the knowledge that 12 years of honest work had survived its most serious test. Not intact, nothing survives a test like that entirely intact, but present. Still there. Recognizable. If you knew what you were looking for.